Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us. Hello, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, and it's my privilege today to introduce to you my friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Badriaki. He is the professor or a professor at Capital Seminary and Graduate School in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in the good old US of A. And it's a beautiful country there in Pennsylvania, all seasons of the year, including now. My friend Michael was born in Kenya and lived much of his life prior to coming to the States in Uganda. And we're going to be talking about Uganda, we're going to be talking about Africa, and we're going to be talking about the coronavirus and community development, and we're going to weave that all together in terms of what we're titling today, The Global Vaccine for Pandemics, Ubuntu.
Yeah.
Michael, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's
Yeah,
good introduction. Yeah.
And in New Wine Tastings, we're always seeking to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We need to hear about the global context. We need to hear of how brothers and sisters from other parts of the world can speak into this issue. It's not just an American phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. And while you're located in the States, you often travel. Much of your family is there in Uganda and in Africa. Define for us before we get going, Ubuntu, since I said it's about the global vaccine for pandemics, Ubuntu. What is Ubuntu?
Paul, thank you so much for the opportunity again to have this discussion. I've always enjoyed our discussions and conversations because they really leave into the New Wine emphasis on building bridges and seeking ways to work that out a little more, to enact that. And I think the beauty about it is it looks like new wine, which, you know, I'm very familiar because I've known you for quite some time, and the work you do, and very supportive, I think it's looking at this idea of what comes out of new wine skins and new wine. It's the passage out of Luke, and so Ubuntu is really about the new wine skin. This idea of the human nature imbued, or the human nature that has the image of God, the imago Dei, and then out of that should really emerge these transferable attributes that we see in the God we want to follow: love, kindness, patience, long suffering. In long suffering, in many ways, has this input of jettisoning our right to be right. Mm-hmm. And the idea, Ubuntu, really out of South Africa in Sinzulu, the language Sinzulu translates to "we are, you are because I am, we are because you are." And it's not necessarily communitarian first. It really is about acknowledging God's stuff in the person, the eternity that God has put in the other person's heart. And how do we draw that out? How do we draw that out of one another? How do we, like many have said, call on the best angels amongst us? And I think for me, from my Christian perspective, I look to God to enact that, and then through me, and I look to God to do that with neighbor as well, so that together we can bring this. We can share agape love amongst one another. It's good for me, good for my neighbor, good for my friends. There's a lot of that to go around. So Ubuntu really is this in Uganda, there are many other languages, and so the idea will translate through the Bantu group, which extends across South Africa, East Africa, and they'll say when things are going wrong, they'll say, where is your humanity? Where is the Ubuntu? Where is the God stuff that God gave you? How comes it's not coming to bear? South Africa during apartheid, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission deliberations, they were calling on this Ubuntu where's forgiveness? Where is the love Black Eyed Peas have sung? So,
yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you. And again, seeing God in the other, God in our relationship, the vertical, so to speak, is vitally important, not simply the horizontal, but both are there, and to draw from Ubuntu. And so we'll be dealing with that subject here today. Michael, you've lived through at least a few deadly epidemics
yes.
that, as you had said in correspondence with me, and I quote, that left families and Uganda hollow
Yeah.
in certain instances.
Right.
And I think a lot of people today with this coronavirus pandemic feel hollow. It's a heaviness of spirit in many contexts.
Yeah.
And I think there's something we can learn from our African friends and others who have experienced epidemics that have taken their toll on communities. Please share about these experiences, however you see fit, and how they have impacted you in your own development as a person and as a leader, these epidemics.
Yeah, epidemics to me now I understand are a global phenomenon. When I was in Uganda, growing up, and people my age and my parents' generation, which is, I'm not that dated really. When we were growing up in school, we were taught as a matter of, you can imagine putting on your uniform, ironing your clothes and going to school every day. And as a matter of curriculum in our subjects, in science, we always had to memorize the 6 killer diseases. I ask my friends, and even people when I'm having conversations with my friends here in the US, when in their lifetime did they go to school to learn about diseases that might kill them, preventable, communicable? When did that ever happen? And I'm surprised no one puts up their hand. You go to Uganda and ask people, do you learn about diseases that might kill you when you actually walk out the door? And that's the way of life. So that we were so aware of 6 killer diseases growing up, many of them now preventable, because medication has improved and care has improved and health systems have been strengthened. We now know more than we knew then. But during that time, we also had to deal with the worst scourge ever, which is HIV/AIDS. So it was 6, now the 7th. And HIV/AIDS, for those that might not know, it starts as HIV and then eventually gradually moves to the status of HIV/AIDS as full-blown HIV/AIDS. In that process, it has what's called opportunistic diseases that the virus basically exposes the patient to. And so, when you get HIV, now you have to worry about all these other diseases just seizing on you and, making you hollow. But so from that epidemiological perspective, it really decimated people, but then it left families hollow because, mom went to work. In most cases, people did not know that they had the virus. And then when they fell ill, it was almost too late, that their viral load was really low. And it was at a time when medication was not there, just like it is now. And if it was there, it was only available for the very wealthy, which is a little bit interesting that some celebrities are making it through, and others, I'm kind of studying that and seeing who has access to what here.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, left rows of homes empty, streets. I remember a time in a village where they used to sell vegetables. A lot of these mothers and fathers had local enterprise, and in the open air market, they used to sell vegetables, and that was the booming commodity there, was agriculture. And then at some point, the booming business was caskets.
Wow.
So you can see. And there's a number of stories to this effect. And so you can imagine the fear, you can imagine the confusion. This was not just talk on TV. It was quite devastating. And the effects to that, of course, it should go without saying that HIV/AIDS now is there's antiretroviral therapy, so it's not a death sentence as it used to be. However, I know family members who are still dealing with the disease, even though they're on medication, and they say it's really still hard on the body.
That's so sobering, and yet you sense the resilience of the Ugandan people in the midst of it. And, you had said before that you're optimistic. You had said this to me in correspondence prior to this interview, that you're hopeful and you're optimistic that the United States will outgrow this episode of the coronavirus and the attached fear. What gives you such confidence or hope that as Americans who, we're not, I think people, no matter what sector of life, what society, can develop resilience, but we've never experienced anything close to this in my lifetime. And unlike you, I am a bit dated. And so, but going back, I mean, we haven't had anything close to this for generations, since the early 1900s, if I'm not mistaken, at least where it's impacted the States. So what gives you that hope and that confidence, which is encouraging to me, Michael, but what gives you that?
I think for me, it's going through what I went through, what many families went through, what a whole country went through at that time. At one point, Uganda was actually the highest, was on top of the list of the highest infected countries with HIV/AIDS. And then after a few years of resilience, grief, a mixture of grief, suffering, pain, untold emotions. I chuckle sometimes when people want fellow human beings somehow to have it all together and, make sure they are emotionally healthy all the time. And I think there's a tyranny with that, because when you are under duress of untold immense suffering, Job, I think what I learned from reading Job's 3 friends is that, Michael, try not to be like them, because I can be like them. I think we get too comfortable and we want everything to be pristine. But my goodness, I saw families deal with death in a way that, honestly, Paul, my theology fell apart. So I learned from the mothers who were losing children, and I would go to them and say, how is it that parents are burying children? Shouldn't it be the other way after parents have kind of lived through? And the mothers would say things that, I'm sometimes hesitant to share these things, but the mothers would say things that it was like, wow, where does she get this? Where does she get this strength? Where does she, I have so much respect for mothers and fathers, because what I would hear them say, and these are people who really, all they had were their gardens. They didn't have mansions or anything like that, but the way they bore the suffering was to call on being together. And for them, they saw their role as trying to strengthen us.
Mm.
So how does that happen, Paul? I don't know.
Yeah, that's such a sobering phenomenon, and yet so profound in terms of what we can learn from these mothers, even in the midst of tragedy, and what you even said about Job's friends, not to be like them, because it's so easy for us to be that, to give one another space and to learn from one another, and to really listen carefully. I sense you were listening carefully to people in your context. And that's going to take us into some other themes we're dealing with today. How well are we listening? Well, Western medicine and economic stimulus and relief packages can do much good. They can easily mask the core problem of relational isolation that we experience in our world today, which, again, I think we have to really listen well,
Yeah.
to perceive well. And we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
With Ubuntu, there's this idea of I see you. I see you, right?
Yes.
I see you, I hear you. And that relational isolation is the most deadly virus. Social distancing, as in physical space, is much needed now, no question about it.
Right.
But let's not confuse that with relational distancing. And that's hard. I mean, because, social and relational do go hand in hand, but we can still have proximity relationally, even in the midst of this need for space because of the coronavirus's spread. Relational distancing would prove even more disastrous than ignoring calls presently for social distancing, in my estimation. As hard as that is, what are your thoughts about this in light of what you've talked about with Ubuntu, what you've talked about so far with listening and perceiving well these parents, these mothers and such in the context of Uganda? How might that shed light on our situation today?
So with and again, I'm going to try and contextualize it, and hopefully I can bridge the sort of process of understanding and sense making for those that want to understand it better. So the mothers and fathers who we would work with, much more like it was in South Africa in the Truth and Reconciliation process. A lot of the perpetrators of the violence during apartheid were now coming around to disaster had happened. Apartheid, you could almost classify it the sorrow was at a pandemic level. And that was a breakdown of relational togetherness. It really was, it came out of a doctrine of relational isolationism. And Paul, this is where we, people of faith have to be sensitive, because the seeds of apartheid really came out of Christian theology through the Dutch Reformed Church. It was called the DRC in South Africa. And a lot of the theology was really geared towards racial purity and therefore separationism. Wow. So we have a deeper problem there, you can see, because COVID is upon us here in 2020, maybe late 19, whenever the epidemiologists will ever come out and say when it came into the soil. But the question we have to ask when it comes to relational isolation is, what were the pre-existing conditions? What were the conditions before the epidemic hit? Because we were still dealing with racial issues. We were still dealing with a history of division. We, Smith and Emerson have written their quite sobering treatise there on Divided by Faith, but there's many other books that really talk about what this is. Dr. King talked about the 11 a.m. on Sunday morning. So redlining still isn't, those consequences and those aftermaths are still here. And so social distancing, while it's a strategy, should not blind us from this work that still needs to be done. And I think that's what, so epidemics can be they are a problem, but they can also expose the opportunity for us to even work harder to get along, because we really need each other. Even while we practice this social distancing, we still need to work towards not being that wineskin that breaks. And I'm afraid, I'm honestly afraid that, Paul, there's a resurgence around the world, globally, towards isolationism. And while the epidemic is a problem, I think there are other strategic global problems of our times that we really need to speak into, we need to deal with, we need to work on. And they are at an individual level, they are at an institutional level, they are at a theological level, they are at a political level. We really need a robust approach. He is an example, a story I heard from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I visited Cape Town, South Africa, while doing research. And I heard from one of the ladies who was really on the commission, Mary, and she told stories. And then I went ahead and read some, another story in the evening, just really, as I was so focused on, wow, how could this have happened? There was a story of a grandmother who went through, whose Black South African grandmother whose relatives were killed. And the perpetrator, he came to the table during one of those meetings and asked for forgiveness. And she was blind. And she was shaking. Everybody was in tears. There was no dry eye in the room. And she hadn't spoken. She was blind. She said, hey, and they asked her grandmother, what do you have to say? And she said, I have one request of the perpetrator of the crime. Can I touch your face? Because she wanted to be able to, you can see, to the idea of relational empathy and relational touch. We need that. But she teaches us that that's very important. She touches his face and she says, can I ask you one question? I forgive you. Mene, can I ask you one question? She says, can you now be my son? Since you took away my son, can you now be my son? But this is in South Africa. In Rwanda, they had an indigenous approach that was named the Gacaca courts, pretty much the same as South Africa. In Uganda, we had a similar process in the northern part of Uganda with Joseph Kony that came out of the Acholi tribe. And they have this idea called Mato Oput. So you can see that out of relational being, and excuse me for bringing in Heidegger here, but this idea, his idea of Dasein has quite been, it's captivated me, even though I don't subscribe to his politics. But the idea of being is quite a beautiful idea. Wow, this is, and the relational being comes out of people coming together and saying, instead of saying we really can't get along, how can we work to get along?
Yeah. And with that, and thank you, Michael, and just what a powerful story of the woman there in the courtroom and forgiving the man and saying, "Will you be my son?" That's riveting. Like, how in the world can that even be possible? But it's radical. And again, I think it's a reflection of Ubuntu, seeing God somehow in the midst of all this, and seeing ourselves in relationship. And as you also said, Michael, the nativism that's so rampant globally, the isolation that we see, the nationalism. Well, you know, it's good for nations to take pride in their histories and their cultures. It should never be in the context of coming out with language like the Chinese virus, or language like that. This virus knows no boundaries. This virus attacks humanity, and now we're seeing that it can even attack other forms of life. But you know, it attacks humanity, and we must work together. So that's why I love stories of nations working together in the midst of this and partnering to try and fight against this menace, not of other nations,
Right.
but of the coronavirus. Um, let me change gears here with another question. What might we learn from our Ugandan friends, Michael, for how to overcome the relational isolation and address the anxiety and panic around the coronavirus pandemic? Here I'm thinking about that word Ubuntu again. What further words might you offer? And that's going to take us into the discussion of global missions in just a minute and how
Right.
it's often done. But before we get into that, just as a transition point, what specifically can we learn as relates to Ubuntu on this matter right now with moving beyond it with the isolationism?
It's an inviting question, and I think I would say I'd continually put the invitation out there uh, for for people to listen to people's stories, and to listen to people's stories. I think if anyone meets a Ugandan, a Kenyan, a Tanzanian, I would say listen to their stories, and for where they cannot express or articulate what might seem like a gap, that should not be taken as a form of incompetence or inferiority or some kind of a pathology or or confirmation bias of, aha, you see, that's what I saw on TV, so that's who they are. It calls for, you know, I've argued elsewhere that this idea of faithful friendship and interdependent partnership, it really requires putting the other person's interests ahead of yours, ahead of mine. And that should be done for Ugandans, for Kenyans, Americans, but the history, our history. So you ask the question right, and I think our history does not allow for that, because for a long time, Western epistemological, you know, ethnocentrism has always been of the idea that we are the best going to the rest. So I think being aware of these traps, being aware of the anthropology people assume of, say, the Ugandan, the theology, you know, the idea of, you know, Ugandans are Africans, so therefore, you know, they come from the lineage of Ham. Ham was cursed, and you know, the Hamitic curse. There's all these deep problems here that I think they really hinder the opportunity to listen to people's stories and to look at them from a balanced perspective. So, Paul, I'm emphasizing this because I know that as a Ugandan, many people approach me, you know, either with rose-colored glasses, or I can actually see the biases. I can see and I have to survive these things. And so I know that I've heard from other, you know, fellow Ugandans, and before they can learn, they need to be able to work to break the barriers, their perceptions towards Ugandans. It is a plea, because I think that is the number one barrier for me, is how will people listen No, well, selectively, sure. Actively listening, okay. But what happens when you can't bear their story anymore, and it's too tragic for you, and it's too foreign? I'm sure there's temperamental issues there. There's personality issues there as well. But my question, I think, what I'm aching for nowadays is how can we listen to people's stories? Who are their parents? How do they get married? How do they grieve? Um, is it okay for them to express anger? You know, there's a way in which, is it okay for a person from Uganda to express pain? Because historically, in scientific racism, as a notion, you know, it's the idea that if you're of a darker complexion, you can't express pain. Your pain is of a lower, maybe you have a higher tolerance of. So there's these historical but latent notions that really hamper understanding the Ugandan.
Well, and with that, again, as we think about the word Ubuntu, if we were really truly seeing God in the other, and it's just God in ourselves, we wouldn't have that kind of thinking. You know, and I think the biblical notion of Ubuntu, I mean, the notion of Ubuntu to me has biblical moorings. It has connections. Even if it arose outside of that, you know, the biblical world, there's resonance with what Scripture is talking about, that we are only who we are in relationship to others, and the image of God is in all people, not more so in Western peoples, and so on and so forth, the West and the rest, or the West is best, and so on and so forth. But to really have an inquisitive spirit, to see the other and the like. And I think if we're going to move forward in the midst of this global pandemic, that again is global, we have to have a global appreciation for our fellow humans, a global appreciation and a global understanding, a holistic understanding is what we're trying to get at here for our viewers. And so what does that look like as we engage in mission? Let's say Americans go overseas to engage in mission. Let's say there's a decrease in the spread of the coronavirus and we want to go and help in other contexts, you know, moving forward. How do we go with Ubuntu rather than the lack thereof, rather than that nativism, rather than that segregationist theology that so often shapes mission? How do we move beyond that? And that takes us to another discussion. And that is, we find relational isolation in mission work.
Yeah.
We often have no idea that we are spreading this isolation virus in world evangelism, community development work, and disaster relief. As a result, we may think we have nothing to learn from Ugandans' struggle with epidemics to address our present pandemic crisis, including this interview with you. Maybe people don't think they really have anything to learn because, well, the West has it best, and we know how to do mission. And mission can be, if we're not careful, be very colonizing and segregationist. So thoughts on this, Michael, please.
Yeah, so I think in these conversations I have made it a purpose to again invite more consideration that Uganda, obviously, and other parts of like any other part of the world, is not perfect. There's challenges. There's challenges economically. There's challenges, you know, with the way certain things are done, just like any other place. You know, let me just go a little bit back, Paul, to even why I'm hopeful and optimistic that the US will outgrow this time, because I think every day has its own news, but like we can even see the media, the tone of the scientists and the people at the forefront is sort of changing. They're starting to see some changes. The mayor in New York City is saying things are changing. They're a little restrained in their hope, but I think the idea that we can be hopeful even amidst disaster is is something to be oriented towards and attuned to, because if we're on the extreme of just hopelessness, we could plunge in a sense of nihilism at an individual level and at the societal level. So the same goes with Uganda, is that even with the challenges, I think most Ugandans are really, they want to be hopeful about what can change. What can change in a culture, because culture is not static. What can change in certain cultural practices that need change? Ugandans, I think, to me, are open to that conversation. I'm not quite sure, now, especially being sort of in the throes of it. I'm not quite sure what to say about certain aspects of Western missiology in the academy, particularly, and in the organizations that are promoting certain notions. Because when I look at the current work, and it really is promoting, surprisingly, cultural paternalism. It is promoting a sense of isolationism. It's promoting, it's really promoting the latent negative stereotypical threats. For example, there's material now in the Christian academy and seminaries that, as a Ugandan, I read the stories, and I encourage my fellow American brothers and sisters, find a Ugandan, find a Nigerian, and ask them to look at this particular story. Can it be true? And Paul, we can't recognize it.
Well, and again, how well are we listening to our African brothers and sisters when we're doing missions work? If it's this kind of colonialist enlightenment construct of the dark continent, we don't necessarily have to listen. I'm saying this is wrong, but we don't have to necessarily listen, right? Because we already know what's best. And so even in contexts where we might think this is cutting edge missions work, and we think we're doing right by the Africans, have we often asked the Africans what they think? And I think that's what you're in part getting at. Ask someone what they think about this take on this story. Ask an African, ask someone who has enough space that they don't feel like, we're going to be so offended, but we can really have an honest conversation. Ask them what they think about this. And are we really willing to listen and see, is what I hear you getting at.
Right. Are we really listening, and are we willing to tell the story truthfully, in a way that if a Ugandan reads it, there'll be resonance. They'll say, this is a practice of research, but this is a practice of just sheer fidelity to a friend.
Yes.
If I write something that Paul said and cares about, will Paul be able to say, actually, I recognize that, I said that, but actually that's how my grandmother used to do it, so that Paul is saying, Michael listened well to my relatives. Well, I'll give you an example here of a book that's really it's known. I don't know how, somebody said it's not that popular, but I was told it wasn't, but I think it is, because everywhere I go, it is, people have latched to it, and I wonder why. But it's the book When Helping Hands. Brian Fickett and Stephen Corbett in the book tell a story of a lady who came to one of Brian's business meetings, and she was practicing sorcery. She got saved. That's good news. But at some point, she falls sick, and they find out that she's actually HIV/AIDS positive, and she has tonsillitis, and she's in excruciating pain. Well, he says that she went to her neighbor in the slum and her neighbor cut out those tonsils with a kitchen knife. Paul, he's writing this book in 2009. Paul, that is criminal in Uganda. And in the area he's talking about, this is not too far from the capital city. I know the place, actually went there. But let's assume that that's true. So I've asked medics, including my sister, who's a medical personnel. I've asked American brothers and sisters, what do you think about this story? And many of them say she should have died. I mean, because that's a very serious surgery. But somehow it happened in a non-sterile environment with a kitchen knife. Those kitchen knives, if you ask any Ugandan, those kitchen knives are rudimentary, especially if someone who's bought from the manufacturing local guys in the slummy areas. That knife is not like what you buy in Macy's. But you can't even use what you buy in Macy's, Paul. So we are lost when we read this. This is a break of trust. Again, here goes the story. Could that story be true? Many of us don't think so.
And I wonder are you also saying, perhaps, Michael, that even if it were true, should it be shared? Should it be told?
It would be. I think the authorities in Uganda would have handled it, and it would have been a totally different story. But in the way it's told, the way it's just we're besides ourselves.
Well, with that, you make some comments in a recent article where you're addressing some of these themes, and I want to get into those if I could right now, some of those quotations, and ask you to respond, some things that you're saying in the article. As I think about what you're saying, as you're engaging this and other themes and dealing with community development, I think that the economics of God's kingdom and the triune God's mission flows out of communion and not commodification. In the Western world, our market-driven reality, things are so often framed by way of a market of commodities. And I don't hear you offering that as the way forward to think in terms of commodification, but communion with Ubuntu.
Right.
And so as I was reading your paper, I was thinking about this. And in this piece, you assert, and I quote, if Western evangelical Christians are desirous to experience life in a meaningful manner in Uganda, they need to follow a process of contextualization that involves a vulnerable, credible friendship, which strengthens brotherly and sisterly interaction with Ugandans over years. Such a soul formational demeanor demands a biblical approach to contextualization. And, as we think about, post-coronavirus world, the devastation that it's causing in America and elsewhere, how are we going to engage missionally in this context where our same segregation, our nativism show up, post-colonial, whatever you want to call it, in how we engage? And you're talking about when helping hurts, and it's up to the viewers to engage, your work, your reading, your writing, what the authors are doing there and other books. But as you reflect on this book that you alluded to earlier, you said, and I just want to take on board your point and wanting people to hear your point, however they view the book or other pieces of literature, right, that I think this is key, what you're after. This is the way forward for missions in a post-coronavirus pandemic world. Mm-hmm. And that is, you call for vulnerable friendship. And I would say if you were to write a book, you probably have it as something like a further book, an additional book to some of your other works. Right. When vulnerable friendship heals. When vulnerable friendship heals.
That's a good title.
Well, you can use it because it basically comes from words that I drew out from your article. You maintain that when helping hurts Ugandan agency, their own self-expression, you've argued. And I think that's worth us thinking about because, I want my books to be critiqued. I want my works to be critiqued for the greater good, as long as we're trying to read carefully and honestly and openly. And so all of us, I think we're in this together, Ubuntu, to critique, to analyze the idea that Western missionaries, and this is a quote from you again, should not hurt or harm Ugandans in order to, quote unquote, let Ugandans do it for themselves. In your estimation, what you've argued is presumptuous, and I'm quoting you, condescending, Afro-pessimistic, and laden with hubris. Those are, those are really strong claims, but you have skin in the game. I mean, as a Ugandan, you're concerned for your own people.
I do.
You also assert, and I quote, suggestively, it would be reasonable for the custodians of When Helping Hurts to credibly consult within dialogue with Ugandan organizational leaders, academics, missiologists, pastors, and communities before developing their ideas about how to help Ugandans. And, I don't know enough about the research in this field, but I think that's just important for me to do whenever I'm making claims on how to engage others. Am I listening to the people on site? Am I watching? Am I seeing them? Am I hearing them? And from your vantage point, that wasn't occurring in this context. And you say here, and I quote, to learn from their understanding of whether Fickard actually hurt or harmed Grace. This is a woman that you were, I believe, talking about just a minute ago in the Ugandan context. And you say, and I'm going to highlight this, this is necessary because of the tendency, your words, by Western development practitioners to devalue the importance of the agency of Ugandans, their generosity, and their dignity. And you say a clear example in Fickard's case is when a Ugandan pastor who sensed his discomfort of helping Grace attempted to counsel and caution him with the following words, don't feel bad, take their gifts with joy, this is how they show their love for you. Comes from their book, When Helping Hurts. Yet, the When Helping Hurts experts, you claim, and I quote, ignored the voices of their Ugandan counterparts to insist on their Western understanding of hurt. And when I'm listening to that, and I'm thinking about, okay, ministry, global work in a post-pandemic world, how are we going to move toward true healing, true relational solidarity? What do I need to learn from it? People can debate the books and the articles, your research, their research. I'm just highlighting this and thinking about it for myself. Let's say the Ugandans don't have the economic resources that we have in the West. We have that as something that we dearly prize, what we can do financially. And there's a place for it, no question about it. But there's giving that occurs that I can easily miss if I think merely in terms of commodification or commodities, is what I hear you getting at.
Right.
And I have something to gain from a person who is poor financially, but rich relationally. And Grace, even the name Grace, is offering something. Am I willing to receive it? Do I feel guilt? I'm speaking for myself here, because they're wanting to offer it, and it gives them joy to share that with me, even as they receive from me. How do I engage with people who might not have my academic training? I'm speaking as Paul Lewis Metzger here, my own academic training, or where I am on the socioeconomic ladder.
Yeah.
Do I feel like I have anything to gain from them, or am I only the one who gives? And global missions must go both ways. Ubuntu goes both ways.
Right.
Ubuntu is a sharing.
Yes.
And I think the colonial project that comes out of my own heart in many ways is I still have to be the one who's ultimately the giver. If I'm the receiver, something's wrong. I'm not as strong. But you said vulnerable friendship. And when vulnerable friendship heals is the title of your next book. I'm sure of it. You haven't done it yet.
I've just been assigned it.
You have,
Professor. So,
but I think that's what you're after. You tell me if I'm wrong, but if we have this mindset the one that you're critiquing, from your vantage point, as I'm reading this and as I'm thinking about, we won't be able to vaccinate ourselves against the pandemic of relational isolation, the very point we started out with in this interview.
Yeah.
Global isolation problems require global relational solutions, Ubuntu, give
Right.
and take. And,
Right.
it can't be framed simply in terms of commodities. And I just want to say one last thing and then offer it up for you to reflect at greater length on this.
Please.
But vulnerable friendships, as I read your work, as I've interacted with you over the years, vulnerable friendships of the Ubuntu variety heal and vaccinate us against relational isolation. I, as an American, need to hear that. It's so easy for me to think the West is the best, better than the rest. And I need that Ubuntu. I need to gain from Ugandans. Many Americans may be disturbed by Russian airplanes bringing things to us. And who knows what's going on with that? I don't know.
Right.
Or China sending medical gear to us. Maybe we don't like that. I don't know. I would say if people are trying to help us, I should receive, just as we want to offer them. And I hear you saying, let's receive from one another in different ways. You've expressed the need for a global response of non-anxious Christian presence. What does this look like within the Ubuntu mindset that you're articulating? And what closing thoughts, these are open-ended thoughts for further discussion,
Okay.
to share with us?
Well, I think so. So going back to the fact that human beings, Ubuntu, these are people that Christ died for. So I think beginning there, that there's something about this God's mission that is bent on redeeming people. And that's all of us in our specific context, locally and globally. But I think that we really need, and I think that, to me, this is the beauty of how, the day and age, the digital age that we're in, the technological age that we're in, even with its problems, is the beauty that we are meeting more than ever. We have the opportunity to talk more than ever. Look at this already for us, meeting on this technological application here. But Paul, what we have to wrestle with are the old sentiments that were taught us epistemologically, theologically, philosophically, anthropologically, that are meant to keep us divided based on pseudosciences, based on really things like scientific racism. And so Grace, the grandmother story, and many like that, really teach us, the many that are suffering from COVID-19, the families that are grieving, really teach us that suffering does not discriminate. Suffering really, anyone is fair game. They're calling COVID the great leveler. And, the Prime Minister of the UK is may he recover, may he be on a speedy recovery. But, no matter class, no matter height, no matter one's physiognomics, the epidemic has scared, has touched almost everybody's nerve. So for many Christians, they've been anxious as well about it. When it comes to God's mission, we have to ask the question, what input does that bring to our anxiety, to our fears, to our relationships? And I like how you framed the question in the opening of this section here, the economics of the kingdom and the triune God's mission. I think to me, that's the point, is that it's God's mission, it's not mine. I can't colonize it. I can't capitalize it. I can't commodify it. But the day I think I can do that, then goes the whole, then I can do that to anybody else. Mm-hmm. So it's God's mission, it's not mine. Chris Wright has written extensively about this as well. John Stott really talked about this extensively, but I think your own lectures with Karl Barth's thinking, you know, there's this idea that the triune God, really, that's where it begins. And so what import does that have for us? And to me, what's worrisome is that the experts, Western experts who are bent on making sure they fix the problem of Ugandans being on the receiving side, have turned out to be culturally paternalizing and patronizing and really exhibiting more hubris in making it about them and undermining our agency. Mm-hmm. And so the very same thing they say they're trying to fix, the hurt they say that's happening over there because of helping, they're doing the very same thing. Brian could have listened to the pastor telling him, look, don't feel bad, you've helped. But isn't it the case that as a way of redress, we say, let's listen to one another? That Ugandan pastor's voice was totally run over, rendered impotent, totally dismissed. And that's really what we face, Paul. And so I think we really need, I think we need God's Spirit to help us. But I think these deeply ingrained ideas about the other, to me, I find are really tripping us up a lot, because my goodness, you know, Ugandans receive gifts, but they give gifts. Do you know, Paul?
That's the key point. That's the what? Yeah, please develop that.
Yeah, Ugandans receive gifts, but they give gifts as well. This is culturally, this is imbued in our cultures. I mean, there's the idea of gifting. I mean, you need to only go and see what happens at weddings. My goodness, people bring all kinds of gifts to the bride and groom. You need to talk to pastors in the village who receive fruit, bananas. So the idea that Ugandans are not generous and all they are beggars holding up begging bowls straight at the airport when the missionary comes, that is just not true. Ugandans, just as, let me look at it just from a diaspora's perspective, even in the COVID time and post-COVID, is, you know, that Ugandans and many immigrant workers from outside the Western world, particularly from out of America, they send more money back home in remittances than aid combined. That's not told. Those are Ugandans sending back money to build homes for their parents, to improve on the sanitary situations back home, to improve on businesses back home. Even after they give and spend money, they still can use help from their brothers and sisters in the West. This seems so elementary to me. This seems so basic to the idea of Christian charity and Christian generosity. But the idea that Africans are totally dependent with their mouths, eyes wide open and arms begging, that is a caricature that has so surprisingly, to me, taken, you know, the hipster church. Brian has perpetrated this idea of toxic charity has perpetrated this, because there's this idea that if there's a problem in dependency, it is always on the side of uh, a group of people, and they look physiognomically different than the group that's claiming that there's dependency. It goes back to the welfare queen caricature. The welfare queen, if you look in literature, doesn't have a name from, Leave It to Beaver. The name doesn't come from, it is always the other. But I'm thinking of Jesus sitting at the temple and looking at, the Pharisees coming to give, the wealthy people coming to give, people that had, and scripture says they gave out of their wealth. And he saw the widow come. This widow, we don't even know her name. She comes, she gives out of her poverty. And Jesus highlights that. He says, look at what that faith looks like. I can tell you, Paul, you only need to go to the villages. Grandmothers are bent over with children on their backs of their daughters or their sons, digging their gardens. Their daughters are doing the same. They are giving. They are giving. They are always giving. And so for Brian and anyone to wag their finger at them and say, look, you're not giving enough because you're dependent. We've confused government-to-government aid with the general Ugandan. And so we are blaming Ugandans for depending on aid. But do you know who gives aid? It is everybody who pays taxes. So what are they doing about that? What should Ugandans do about that? But church-to-church generosity should look different. In other words, Paul, you've given to me, but you haven't had strings attached. So,
well, and I think with what we're talking about, and just for our viewers and our listeners to reflect on your research, and you've written about this, and could you just share the titles of some of the work that you've been doing for our viewers, and then I'll come back to the point you just made.
Yeah, so I've written a book, and it's a response in part to When Helping Hurts. And my book is When Helping Works. In fact, I feel like I've been a promoter of Brian and Stephen Corbett's work. I try to separate the authors with the ideas, because I think they are decent people. Their work really hurts us. In fact, in Uganda, in our languages, there's no word for hurt. What we talk about is pain or bulumi. When somebody has done something that causes me pain, we say, you've pained me. Hurt here in the Western world is relevant. I don't have candy, I'm hurt. Oh, you didn't. It's very relative. Pain, we talk about pain. They have pained us. I talk to pastors, and pastors are totally dumbfounded. So my book is it's When Helping Works, Alleviating Fear and Pain in Global Missions. It is my first book, so I'm not perfect as an author there, but I had to get the idea out there. That this work is suffocating us in every instance. I've read the book over and over, their book. I've analyzed it. I can go off page by page to show that we really, really are in trouble if we go with that. And I'm surprised that many churches gravitate towards it, but in many ways I'm not, because I've also looked at the historical roots of this idea, and God forbid that it continues.
Well, you had mentioned before that you've benefited from me and no strings attached, and I have certainly benefited from your perspective, your research. It challenges me. It pushes me. If I listen carefully, I think it would make me to be more vulnerable in my leadership. I think that when we talk about the post-pandemic world, as God leads the world through it, we've got to understand more and more that even in the midst of losing jobs, even in the midst of losing health, let's not lose one another. And, I think you and I've talked about this. I've talked to a pastor whom I've interviewed for the same series at New Wine Tastings. You've gone to Haiti, and he's gone to Haiti. He's an Anglo. He's part of a mega church in the Beaverton area. And both of you have said that what you've learned from the Haitians is just mind-boggling. In Uganda, you have relationships, strong relationships, but the Haitians, we always think about impoverished, because we think certain structures of what flourishing means. And of course, financial gain can be of great benefit. Medical care can be of great benefit. Infrastructure can be of great benefit governmentally. So let's say that's missing in a country like Haiti. But what do they have to offer in terms of Ubuntu that we need to learn from and need to gain? I think I get so fixated, Michael, on physical financial resources. I mean, I just get fixated. And you've taught me over the years, you can accomplish a lot with a little if you're not doing it in isolation, but doing it with others.
Right.
And I think that's what you're saying, is that we all have something to learn. I have something to learn, and I cannot be thinking about helping and hurting simply in financial terms. I might have something to offer financially.
Right.
But Grace has something to offer me
right.
in this context, and other people have. And am I listening? Am I looking? And in coronavirus world, I think it's very threatening for me as an American, because everything that we prize as Americans with health and wealth is being challenged. That the coronavirus, Christian and non-Christian, it attacks. It attacks people of all walks of life and status. It doesn't care. That really hits us in America, because we can understand it happening in China. We can understand it happening in Africa. But America? And I hate to say it, but it comes at a time when we're talking about make America great again. And I think if we really want America to be great again, we need to see America become great in terms of vulnerable friendships with people across the world, like our Ugandan neighbors, our Ugandan friends. So in the midst of all the social distancing, may we not have relational distancing. I hope viewers, listeners will engage carefully what you're saying. Yes, read books. Read When Helping Hurts with a charitable, careful, critical, discerning eye. To read your work with a careful, critical, charitable, discerning eye. To think through what's really being said. My books too, I welcome it. As we try and engage these themes together, because we're only stronger together, not in isolation from one another. Michael, I just want to say thank you. I always learn so well from you. Any closing thoughts for our viewers and listeners as I go away to process further what you're sharing today, as we think through this theme, as we started global vaccine, the global vaccine for pandemics, Ubuntu, with Michael Badriak. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, and thank you for the invitation. And as always, I mean, Paul, I could have started with the examples that you know between you and I and our friendship. You're one I trust, because I know that in good and bad times, we'll work it out. We'll talk. We'll figure it out. But never at one point have I felt that, oh, because Paul doesn't understand why I'm doing things this way, he has abandoned me.
I haven't gotten on the UN plane yet.
Well,
Hotel Rwanda. So.
Yeah. I think you for some reason you grasped that very well. But so it's possible, because I think what we're talking about here is is something we have to remember has been given to us by Christ. He said, I pray that there would be one as you and I are one. I mean, it's very Trinitarian. Mm-hmm. It's something of the past, really. It was done there at the cross.
John 17.
Yeah, and so we have this space to enact this and live this out. So to me, I think that we're talking about something very tangible that is important for the individual. Mm-hmm. And it is also a societal good. Mm. This idea of God's love that we share. And God's love is going to call us to have the hard conversations, the difficult conversations, to talk about the things we don't want to talk about, and talk about the things that we need to talk about. It's going to be both and even in the pandemic, I think that to me, I only have hope to look forward to because I've seen it before. Epidemics come and they go. The question is, when that time comes for us to reassociate, to meet again, to talk again, are we going to go towards God and neighbor? Or is fear going to paralyze us? And when fear paralyzes, it draws on these unconscious thoughts. And I hope the church can be a better demonstration of this than what we see. This idea of localism, the church over here, the church over there. Look, the pandemic doesn't know that. Mm-hmm. I mean, those barriers to me reminds me of the Berlin Conference in 1884, where Africa was partitioned to create those borders without Africans on the table. So, to me, this is sort of a recapitulation to those sentiments, and so I hope in closing that we will always remember that this unity we seek for is given by Christ. Money can buy many things, but it can't buy that.
Yeah. Well said, Michael. And I look forward to our next interaction. And from Portland, Oregon to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and all the way to Africa and back, Ubuntu. So thanks for being my Ubuntu brother, Michael. And blessings to you and the family.
You too. Say hi to the family.
Michael Badriaki and Paul Louis Metzger, thank you for joining us for New Wine Tastings. Blessings to you all. God bless.
All right.